Congratulations to you.
Friends, welcome. Welcome. Okay. Let me try it again.
I can hear you.
Welcome to Union Presbyterian Seminary. We are delighted that you are here this afternoon for our panel discussion, where our question is, what are seminaries for? And I want to say, before I introduce our panelists, which I'll do in just a moment, I want to say a word about logistics. So we will have plenty of time towards the end for some questions and answers from you all. And there are two ways for you to participate in that. First of all, as we're going along through the panel, be thinking of your questions and go ahead and write them down. And here are the two ways. If you prefer, you can use that QR code, which is on the card that you should have received when you came in the door, or it's on your seat. There's a QR code there for Slido, or you can go to slido.com and put in the number that is there, and you can put your question into Slido at any time during the panel. And Dr. Lakeisha Lockhart, who is here, yes, one of our fabulous Christian education faculty members here at Union. Dr. Lockhart is going to be staffing that Slido, and she will be going through and looking at those questions and helping us to coordinate that. If you would prefer to just write your question on a piece of paper in the traditional manner, then please go ahead and do that. You should have gotten a card where you can do that. And our fabulous Dean, Ken McFadden, right here on the front row, will come around and collect those in about 45 minutes, or as we move towards the Q&A time. So two ways to get your questions to us. You have fairly some robust bio for each of our panelists today, so I'm not going to read that. It's right there on your card, but I will just very briefly introduce our panelists to you. So starting on my far left, your right, is Dr. Eric Barretto, and he teaches New Testament at Princeton Theological Seminary. Next to him is Union Seminary's very own Rich Voles, who teaches preaching for us. And next to him is the Reverend Gail Henderson Belcito. She is a pastor out of Charlotte and a Union Seminary alum. Woohoo! Yes. Okay. Yes. Next to her is the Reverend Jessica Tate, also a Union alum, who's a pastor. Yes. And is a pastor out in Georgetown in D.C. And next to her, next to me, is Dr. Kenda Dean, who teaches youth culture. Have I got it right? Youth, church, and culture. Or the other way around. It's youth, it's church, it's culture, some mix of that in there. She teaches that at Princeton Seminary. And I am just thrilled and delighted to have this wonderful group of thought leaders with us as we think about the question of what are seminaries for in our time and our day. So that question may seem a little strange to us, what are seminaries for? Because I think in an earlier era, everyone knew exactly what seminaries were for, right? They prepared clergy for churches, for congregations, and chaplains as well, but mainly clergy for congregations. That is still true, to be clear. They may say something else, I don't know, but I'm telling you that yes, that is what we do, but we also do some other things. And the question is, what is most needed in the time that we are living in, and how can seminaries help to prepare leaders for the church and for society? So I'm going to start with that question. We're not building up to the big question. We're going to start with the big question and go from there. So I'm going to ask each of them to weigh in a little bit on this question: what are seminaries 4. And I think we'll start with Eric on the far end.
I got thrown to the wolves to
Oh,
go
I see
first.
you were thrown into, okay. Clearly, I have no power at all, which is fine.
That's right.
They've already taken over the whole thing. Wonderful. Gail, go first.
Well, I mean, I think, as you were suggesting, seminaries are places where we are trained to go into ministry in the world, to be the church in the world. And I think what came to me as I thought about the question in preparation for this was seminaries need to be places where we are also listening, right? That we're not just being told things, but that seminaries are listening to students. Where are we in the world? What are we seeing? I feel like if a seminary is not helping students to be able to talk about Gaza and Haiti and Sudan and what's happening in the world and meeting our congregants and our world, our community where it is, then what are we doing this for, right? Like to create, to not create because we've already been created, but to honor the stories that people bring into seminary, that we're not just reading old people, sometimes deceased, mostly deceased people, but that we're reading our own stories and our own lives and bringing that as sacred text as well. And so we are relating to one another. It's not a one-way, I'm giving you information, but it's a round table. It's listening to one another and preparing all of us, because I don't think seminaries should only be for people who are going into ministry, because we're all in ministry in our lives. So we need to be not just in these beautiful spaces, but taking what we are learning here and incubating here out into the world, into the community.
Thank you. That's a wonderful start for us. All right, y'all are in charge. Who's going next?
Oh, I think related to that, I was thinking this morning that in some ways seminary for me is a theological argument. That the work of vocation, the work of formation, the work of education is not solitary work. And so that we need other people to do this work together. So we need teachers who have studied and pondered and share their wisdom. We need classmates with their own stories and their own vocations. I often talk in my classroom about the importance of looking in a congregation to look to your left and to your right, to people who read the Bible in very different ways than you do, have lived a very different life than you have. That those are moments of formation and education for us. But I think also, too, that as a reminder, as a formation, that the work that we do, the vocation into which we are called, is not a new one, but it's one that many people before us have struggled with, have succeeded, and sometimes failed in terrible ways. And knowing that we then become a part of that long chain of witnesses of both success and failure, but in the end, hopefully, faithfulness to God. And in the end, then, I think seminaries, are for us to be taught and reminded that we're not the first to do this work, but neither will we be the last. And so part of our work, then, is how do we create congregations and communities and seminaries that are there for others, whose stories we don't know, whose needs we can't imagine, whose challenges we can maybe start inkling, but they'll have to carry on the work beyond us.
Thank you. Wonderful. All right, we're getting it going here. So, who's next?
All right, they're looking at me, so I suppose it's me. So I take my answer from two sources. The first is from Ed Farley's book, Theologia, which is dated at this point, and I don't agree with him entirely, his argument, but I think a thread that runs through the book is for seminaries to be a partner, right? Not the only, but a partner in the formation of theologia, which he kind of defines as a way of being in the world. He actually calls it a habit of the human soul. And I would revise that to say a habit of the human body and soul, in which we contemplate the mysteries of God, and we develop wise, compassionate, and courageous participation in what gives the world life. So for me, that's thread number one. Thread number two comes from the critical theorist and critical pedagogy leader, Henry Giroux. And I'm just going to read a quote from his book in which he says, teachers, and here I would say seminaries, must work to create the conditions that give students the opportunity to become citizens who have the knowledge and courage to struggle in order to make despair unconvincing and hope practical. So seminaries perform a kind of political intervention in the world, which is what all schools are for at the end of the day. engaging in a kind of in a faith-centered work that engages learners for the work of what he also calls the radical imagination, which also pops up in theological studies, right? And practice in a world filled with despair, which according to Giroux and others is beset to us by what he calls the disimagination machine of the world. So seminaries enter into that work.
Thank you. Those are rich thoughts. You're welcome. You're welcome. Yeah. I'll be here all week. Thank you. All right. Jessica, you want to go next?
I'll pick up on that because I was thinking about how much seminary helps shape us, and church does this as well, but shapes us to actually envision what the promised day of God is, toward which we're all heading. And to help us do that consistently, to figure out how we're persuasive about that out in the world, how we are steeped in our text and our tradition, but also with a reciprocity from what the stories, as Gail was saying, the stories that we're hearing today. So to have all of that rich tapestry together so that we can be painting a vivid picture of that promised day of God so that people want to live toward it and we want to be shaped by it. And I think this isn't the purpose of seminaries, but as I was reflecting on the question, one of the things that has stuck with me the most of my time here, which was a little while ago now, but so many of my professors and administrators here and the staff here when I was here were such generous, wise, discerning folks who you just had a sense that they dwell in the Word of God, and they dwelled in the Word of God made flesh. And to have that sort of close and personal experience with people who have dedicated their lives to that project was really transformative for me and has helped shape me as someone who wants to be embodying that kind of presence in the world. So I don't think that sort of discipleship that we witnessed and got to absorb from the person of the teachers and leaders here at the time, it's not the reason for seminaries, but I think it's an essential ingredient, and I'm really grateful to all of you in the room who are part of that and those who've come after, because that truly is, I think, what we all hope to be as followers of Christ, that people can tell there's something there, and I want that. So I hope that seminaries can be part of shaping that too.
Yes, to all of that. I think it was way easier for me to think about what seminaries should not be. We're getting there. Yeah. Okay. Promise. I'm struck by the way we are called to be something different now than when I went to seminary. And that is something that we're all grappling with. And I am at a loss for a technical answer to that, so I go to metaphor, right? But I'm really won by the Cistercians' view of, in their case, it was the monastery, but the church as a school for love. And I think I would add to that, although I think this is embedded in love, and I'll get to what I mean by that in a second, but a school for courage. And the reason for that is because I do think that, as you guys have already said, we are faithful imagination in a place like this. There are lots of people that are being formed with, Christian imaginations in churches all over the place, maybe fewer than used to be formed, and the ecology of formation is in a shambles, So, but by the time they get to us, they have enough of an imagination that they want to imagine a world through God's eyes rather than through what they see on an average Tuesday. How do we steward people? How do we steward the imaginations of people who are going to lead others in that? And so, that's it.
Okay, that gets us off to a wonderful start. I want to pull a little thread that I heard going through all what you were all saying, just a little one, to connect it to the Sprint lectures that we just heard this week, for those of you who were here, but by John Tatominal, who was talking about the role of desire in relation to truth in a post-truth era, which is the era, of course, that we're living in. Meaning, of course, there is the truth, but most people are not connected to it. Anyway, his yeah, sadly. As many people said who heard his lecture said, oh, these are very timely, unfortunately, and yeah, but also fortunately. Anyway, the thread I want to pull is how he was talking about how we bifurcate the mind and the heart, and we think that the answer to disinformation is better information. Yeah. And he just cut the legs out from under that idea and said, no, it's about our desiring. It's like that we have disordered desires, and how can we address, I'm giving a potted version of it here, but anyway, I'm hearing echoes in what's being said here because he himself in his lecture said, what does this mean for seminary curriculum, right? And I think it has huge implications. It's not just about what's happening up here. Okay, now we're going to get to the question I think Kenda actually wants to talk about, which is, we'll start with this one. What should seminaries start doing? What should they start doing that they are not currently doing? And now we do get to start with you.
Well, I have to answer the other one first.
Okay, all right, never mind. I'm going to flip it. Okay, we did discuss this earlier, but okay, whatever. So what should seminaries stop doing? What should we stop doing? And then we'll get to what
we should stop thinking of ourselves as a credentialing agency. The people who need credentials, I mean, we are going to offer credentials, that's part of it, but that's not our primary, calling in this world, I don't think, right now. You know, right now, the way people are thinking about ministry, and frankly, the way I think the church is moving, I think we're moving towards a more embedded church, meaning something that is not a thing you go to, but it's a thing that you are as part of a community that's dispersed among everything that we do. It's a completely different way of thinking about how we do leadership. And so what does it look like to think about what we are offering less as the steps to a credential and more to, what does it look like to become a leader among, rather than a leader up front. And so there are lots of ways we can take that, but I'll shut up for now.
All right, wonderful. Everyone's like, ooh, okay. No, that's good. Who's next?
I'll chime in. I think certainly I feel I got a really solid training here in Bible and theology, and I was ready to go be an associate pastor at a suburban Presbyterian church, and I did that, and I did great at it. And I think we've got to stop assuming that's where people are headed, because we know they're not. So decentering that as the model of where people are going to be leaders, and start thinking, we already are doing this, so, but recognizing that the way in which people are going to be church is changing dramatically. It's still going to be, I hope, some programmatic suburban churches, but it's not going to be exclusively that. And I wonder if some of the model is not a credentialing one, but maybe more like the Highlander Folk School, that we're training people to be movement leaders. And they're going to need, and that's going to be an embodied practice. So it's going to be head, heart, body, all of it in it together, and learning how to work from community organizing. We have a saying, let's work in the world as it is on behalf of the world as it should be. And I think that paying a lot of attention to the world as it is, because that's who we've got to work with, and meeting people where they are, and the authenticity stuff all comes into that piece of it, I think. And also just the very reality of how do people and systems change, and how do we lead that change? Those are real skills that we need to be learning more of and employing more out in whatever shape ministry is taking, I think, again, toward that promised day of God.
I'm glad that I'm sitting next to you right now. I can follow what you're saying. I think one of the things that seminary needs to stop doing in that light is stop teaching this idea. I guess I'm even disagreeing a little bit. I think we should stop teaching toward this idea that we are creating suburban pastors, right? And I think that we need to start, and I guess this goes back to the other question, is start looking at who's actually in the classroom. Because I think, I read this thing Dr. Shaniqua Walker-Barnes wrote. She said 244 theological institutions in the United States and Canada. In those 244 institutions, there are 122 black females on faculty. Only 30 of them are full professors, right? But if you look at seminary classrooms, who are the students? And so what we are telling people who go through this process, take these classes, write these papers, jump through these hoops, take these exams, and guess what? We're not going to hire you. And so we need to stop pretending that we are preparing the people in front of us and actually think about what that means. Who are the people? What experiences and stories have they brought? What do they already have to bring to the church, the change, the things that we've already survived, the ways we've already had to learn to live through this system and this culture and this process? Speak to the people that are in front of us, prepare. I keep choosing the wrong words. Like, people come prepared, they come ready, right? And let's create, let's open space for the actual lives of the people who are in front of us. Because there are, 80% of Black Presbyterian churches don't have installed ministers, 50% of non-Black churches, right? So what are we doing? We have all these students and we're not, anyway.
I love that. I was thinking of this question on an institutional level. And so I was thinking that seminaries need to stop pretending like we're alone, like we're islands, like we're silos. And we should stop acting, we should stop participating in some ways in the idea that our success is defined by our competition and our independence. From one another. We had a brand, and folks, we cheered because we were, you two were Union grads.
Still proud of that.
Yeah, you should be. You should be. But in the classroom, we teach that interdependence is a theological good, and yet on an institutional level, behind the curtain, y'all, we compete with schools, and so I wonder where we might find our way past that. In terms of where we operate and how we operate on an institutional level. And
we also teach each other to compete. Right? That we are, it's a group project, but it's not really, Yeah.
So we're going to get graded individually.
Yeah. So if we really do preach this radical interdependence and coexistence, then we need to live that out, not just in the classroom and in theological ideas and in our connections with congregations, but at an institutional level.
So I think along these lines, and sharing both theological education and churches, one of the things we should stop doing is stop leading with death. That it's so easy to find articles and laments about the death of the church and the death of theological education. And I don't know, I'm sick of those. And it's not because I don't want us to embrace some sort of naivete where we just assume if we just keep doing the things that we're doing, things are going to be fine. The world is in crisis, and there are broken spaces that we need to name clearly, and those spaces of death need to be named correctly. And yet, last time I checked, we follow a God who is in the business of bringing life from death.
Amen.
So reorienting our institutional life to think about how we might imagine the possibilities of life in places that seem dominated by death. And those aren't programs, those aren't credentials, but to me it's an orienting toward the world and maybe an orienting toward each other where we're not in competition for little bits of life, but instead we are in cooperation towards the flourishing of that much more life.
Well, and then I would also add, and you're going to need to shut me up because I will pick up this microphone a lot, is that we also claim to serve a risen Savior. And so if we really believe in resurrection, then what are we afraid of even if things die, right? Because there is new life. There is more that God is up to. It's not over. And if we are not teaching that in seminary, if we are not living that out, if we are not encouraging, like I said, that incubation of faith and hope and movement and joy, right? Why would anybody want to join anyway?
it's hard to follow that very profound series of thoughts with a very mundane piece of kind of information. But, but I'll just share to Rich's point about institutions and being in competition with one another. Just the PCUSA seminary presidents and board chairs and academic deans met in January, and there was a new energy in the room around, because everybody's new, we're all new. It was like, yeah, we have, except for Paul. Paul's in the front row here. He's our veteran. He's our seasoned leader, for which we are grateful, because everybody else is new, but Paul is leading us. But in those conversations, there was a fresh spirit of, hey, we need to do things differently. We need to be more collaborative, more in conversation with one another, more mutually supportive, especially around thinking every PCUSA seminary has a distinctive identity and distinctive strengths. How can we help one another to lean into our strengths, which would help the denomination, and beyond the denomination, would help the church, right? Instead of the competitive thing with one another. So we still, I'm looking at Paul, we still have a lot of work to do amongst those of us in leadership, but that was a really energizing conversation that we had. Okay, so that was, what should we stop? And we started in about what we should start. I heard some of that, but want to see if any more fleshing out of like, are there some things we should start doing once we stop doing these other things?
I wonder if we might revisit what it means to bear witness, and that be a key characteristic of our graduates, of folks who go through seminary education. So I think about, because I think about the book of Acts all the time, the beginning of the book of Acts when the disciples are called to be witnesses to the ends of the earth. And I grew up in a church where we knew what that meant. And what that meant was that there were places in this world that were devoid of God's presence, places where the name of Jesus had never been spoken. And if we did not go and bring that name and those stories, that name would never be voiced and God's story would never be known. And I've become convinced that gets the book of Acts and theology exactly wrong. Because what we see happening in the book of Acts is these folks going to places that maybe they assume were devoid of God's presence and find places full of God's presence. And so bearing witness was not just, these are the things that Jesus has done in my life, but to look around and say, wow, these amazing things that God is doing here that I didn't know about, but that you all knew about. And without your story, I could not be the person that God has called me to be. So I wonder if one of the things we might start thinking about, this isn't a technical answer, but more a vision answer, is how do we nurture each other to be witness bearers and to be the kind of leaders that create communities of trust? Because I think the key part of being a witness to someone else's story is that we have to trust that that story might be true. Yeah. And I think about how long African American communities were talking about their mistreatment at the hands of police, and that many of our communities did not believe them until we had phones in our pockets and video proof. So what might it look like for us to form communities where we trust each other's storytelling, not because any community is inerrant, but because we assume God is moving in those spaces?
So when I thought about this question, I spoke to people that I know who are ministers and people that I know who were other students who were with me at seminary. So I'm going to share some of the things that they said, which are very practical things, I think, that seminaries. One, consider more diverse courses. This is Dr. Fanta Lansden. Womenist mysticism, learning about world religions and AI in ministry. How is that going to be involved? Online ministry, as we see in many cases, fewer people in person. How are we going to be able to connect with people in other ways? I say bring back alumni to talk to students about what it's really like out in the world, right? To have a funeral and a sermon and a session meeting and a budget meeting all in the same week, and you've got to be at all of it. Like, what does that look like? And how do you also incorporate Sabbath? So what is it like on the ground? So, and you know, with all due respect for the many wonderful professors I had, they were pretty far from week to week ministry in the church. And so to hear each other's voices, to hear each other's stories, trying to think, Dr. Paula Parker, who you all know well, talked about, let's talk about grant writing and conflict resolution and contract negotiation, the things that are the real stuff of ministry, whether it's nonprofit or church or spiritual entrepreneurship. How do we do these things? How do we take what we've learned and even embodied in the seminary setting and take it out into the world? So those were some ideas that were given to me.
It's great to have those very practical suggestions. I assume this is being recorded, right? I don't have to take notes.
I can give you my notes.
Thank you. No, and you have your notes. Good. Thank you. Kenda?
I think we need to do a little more dying. And I don't mean that some of that's stopping doing things that, have run their course. That's true. But also, I mean, getting out of our own way in ways that allow us to take more risks, to do the partnering that you're talking about, allowing us to not have to be the king of the hill, allowing us to, just decenter a little bit. And, yeah.
It strikes me that what everyone has said in response to this is cultivating curiosity is part of what we need to be doing even more, and not thinking about our curriculum and our processes as closed, but chasing what makes us curious.
Asking questions and then actually listening to the answers, right? Whether you're asking students or the community, the Black Mountain School of Theology doing this community organizing work is saying, we're gonna go outside of the church and ask our neighbors, our physical neighbors, what do they need? Would it matter to them if this church closed down and went away? And if not, then we've got a lot, but communities are answering. We are food insecure. So one church in Laurinburg, North Carolina has turned its campus into a farm, and they're feeding their neighbors. So as seminaries, as churches, let's stop doing all the talking and do some listening.
Well, and going back to what you were saying a moment ago about the sort of team teaching aspect of how are we getting practitioners back on campus often and from a variety of contexts to help everyone imagine what does this look like in practice, and being in conversation with the incredible theologians and biblical scholars here, connected to the realities of everyday life, could be really rich.
Yeah, I mean, my a little bit of my experience as having, when I was at Princeton, worked on getting a church administration course put together, which needed a different title. Oh my gosh. It sounded like it was death, and apparently it was, because only 3 people signed up.
And look at the church now.
But I think part of the problem was that sometimes people don't know what they don't know, right? And so I've wondered about creating some of these opportunities, working with alums, practitioners, especially in the year or 2 out of seminary, when people know more about what they don't know and are eager for that kind of learning. It's very pragmatic as well as deeply theological. So. Anything else on curriculum revision? We're about to undertake curriculum revision here at Union, and there's a lot of enthusiasm amongst the faculty, because when there was sort of a survey went out to be like, hey, are you interested in being on the committee that will undertake curriculum revision? Like half the faculty was like, yes. So that's a sign, right, that there's a lot of energy for that, and that's exciting. But I'm just curious, because I'd love to know the answers to this question. What should our curriculum look like?
I think one thing that we talked a lot about, because we did some curriculum revision together, is that even if we had, if all we had was 3 years of New Testament, and that was all a seminary, it wouldn't be enough. If you gave me 10 years of seminary in the New Testament, it still wouldn't be enough because we're not, you're not done learning when Dr. Lapsley gives you your diploma.
You would
here.
expect 2 New Testament profs to say that.
Yes.
Just pointing that out.
Just more Greek, and that's fine. That's all we need. But then to think about that constraint as possibility, right? So whether it's an intro course or thinking about the whole curriculum, that we can't teach all the things. What we can teach are certain kinds of reading practices and formations towards community and assumptions about how we learn and how we learn from others. I think foregrounding that, content is really, I teach a lot of Greek. I love doing this stuff. The content matters, but to what end is that content? And it's not the filling of minds, but the forming of lifelong learners. So I think, again, that orientation was really important to me in our process and might be helpful here.
One of the things that happened for me with seminary was I feel like I left here with such strong foundations intellectually for what I was about to do, and a lot of ideas about the ideals of the church. And then I got into the church and went, church didn't really like that. And then fortunately, I got some good counseling to do some community, congregationally based community organizing training and got involved with that. And I feel like that is where I learned how to do my job. So it helped put all of the pieces together of the theological truths, the taking the context very seriously, going deep with people's stories, seeing the image of God in them, listening, all of the things that I knew became real. Like, oh, this is how I'm supposed to do my job. And I don't know that could have been taught to me it couldn't be taught in a classroom. And certainly 2 years out, it was like, oh, now I know what I don't know, and I found ways to get it. But surely there's ways to seed some of that even before you leave.
That's a great concrete suggestion. Yeah, thank you.
I would add, I appreciate the work that's happening, for example, with the Katie Cannon Center and courses that are offered at the pace and interest of the students themselves, so they can take a class and move toward a certificate if they choose, but this amazing information is available, and I think that I would love to see that, right? An expansion of almost what I guess in other settings might be called continuing education, that says these courses are just going to be available for anyone to join, and also that invites the perspective and experience of people who are not looking for a seminary degree but are just interested in learning and interested in being in conversation and community, and it takes it out of this sacred setting and says, what do these ethics mean in your life? What do these readings mean in the way that you live your life in the world? And I can be very idealistic about these things, I admit that, but I think that as I thought about what to stop, what to start, curriculum, I'm the kind of person who says throw it all out and start again, and see what do people need to learn now? What are the stories that students in seminary need to hear now? Let's read those. Let's talk to people who are living this out now and not, anyway, like I said, I can be optimistic and unrealistic.
I just before you jump in, I love the idea of taking the current curriculum and just pushing it off the table and saying, okay, if we're going to build, let's build from the ground up, right? And just, I don't mean that some of those things are not important. Right, some of those things are really important.
Absolutely.
But if you just tinker with the thing that you already have on the table, you're not going to kind of get at the work that really needs to be done.
And what if there was a course that was that? We're going to get together, what would you students like to see? What would you, anyway.
That was wonderful. Thank you. Also, Gail, you've spent your time reading our strategic plan because that's what it sounds like, because there's so much of what she's saying in that plan. I'm like, yes, yes, yes. Kenda.
Well, I just wonder whether we're going to know. I don't think we know what our curriculum needs to be. And I don't think we're going to know until we try some stuff. So, if I were in charge of the world,
Go ahead.
I'm betting that your faculty have been noodling for a while on what, if I had free reign and I could make this course relevant for the people in this neighborhood, I don't know, or wherever, I might try this. And I just wonder what it looks like if you give people some free reign to try some stuff out, and without any expectation that it succeed. Because out of those experiments, we learn better what we need to know. I mean, if you ask me what we need to teach tomorrow, yeah, I got some ideas, but I could change my mind like 3 days from now, right? So, what happens if we're not locked in to the traditional path of curriculum review? You review it, which means you think about it, and then you implement the thing you've thought about, but you haven't actually tried anything. So if there's that middle stage of experimental, what would you do if, just to give you some elasticity, I think that we would have a better shot at knowing what we don't know yet, just if we got a chance to try some things. So can I come teach for you?
Any day.
This is being recorded.
That's it. Yep. Go right ahead. Sign you up back here. So, did anybody else want to get in on the curriculum question? No. Okay.
I'll have more to say in the fall.
I wonder if we talked a lot about seminary education. I wonder if is there anything different about how you would answer the question of stopping and starting if we were talking about the church? Is it kind of the same set of, I'm sure there's a lot of overlap there, but are there other things that come to mind around what should the church start doing? What should they stop doing? We've heard, tired of reading the death articles. Yeah, amen to that. Especially when there's so much life. And life comes out of death. That's like who we are. We should embrace that a little more.
Yeah, there's a lot the church needs to stop doing. I think, we're living, at least in the PCUSA, we're in this interesting time where our denomination is 89% white, right? We've inherited this model of post-World War II church that isn't, that franchise is broken now. The franchises don't work. They're not sustainable in the same way. So we need to learn a new position in the world, but we don't know how to do that, and it's hard, and there's a lot of pain in the world that needs our attention and needs a prophetic voice and needs followers of Christ to be attending to and attending with and alongside. So there's just a lot that's in that. I think a lot of the times it feels like the whole thing is broken and needs to stop. And at the same time, the call to be proclaiming the good news is still very much there, and forming people as followers of Jesus on the way of Christ is what we need to do. And to the extent a congregation's Sunday school program is doing that, hooray, keep doing it. To the extent it's not, let's start trying new things and imagining new ways of being and doing a lot of listening in our communities and finding new ways to answer those vocational questions of who are we called to be in the world and what are we called to do. And it's hard to do that when also you need to be raising money from the people sitting in your pews who think they know what they want. But so I guess I just want to name, there's a ton we need to stop doing. And also, it's just really hard in practice to figure out how to make those shifts. But to the extent we can stay focused on shaping people as followers of the way and helping them claim their own vocations in the world, I think we're onto something. And the more we can help each other figure out how to do that and how to tell those stories and how to shape people in that way, we'll be better for it.
I'm teaching a May term class called Worship in the 21st Century, and we're reading a little book that's dated at this point, but just little and lovely, written by Don Salyers, called Worship Come to Its Senses. And he talks about 4 senses of worship: wonder, delight, truth, and hope. Not just the bodily senses, but these 4 overall kinds of senses of worship. And I think truth is what you're pointing us to. The church needs to get busy telling the truth. And he talks about that through the lenses of lament, confession, and testimony, bearing witness. And so bringing those 3 together, I think, are crucial aspects. Stop and start doing at this moment in time is get to the business of truth-telling, and get to the business of finding wonder in God and delight in our communities together. Beyond technique, we can find our way toward technique that's different for every kind of context. But when we find ourselves at the intersection of wonder, delight, truth, and hope, technique can kind of fade into the background, and we can find our way forward.
And I think I love that list of wonder, delight, truth, and hope. For me, the one that, and I could tell so many personal stories, but, and I'll get emotional, but for me, we need to be people of hope. Because there's not just hurt in the world, there's hurt in every single person who darkens the door of our sanctuaries and our places of worship. And if we can find ways to remind them, I'm reminded of Bishop Carlton Pearson, who said that when he became a minister, he had a vision of someone, an ancestor of his, saying to him, "Remind the saints of the hope." Mm-hmm. And that is what I believe we are called to do, and to be people of hope in a world that is so desperate. And we get to say, whether it's in the seminary or in the church, no, I don't have all the answers, but I believe that we can walk together and figure this out, or be sick and suffer and die, but we will do it together. And we will do it with hope in God and hope in what God is still up to in the world. And I just feel like that is, again, if we don't have something to offer that is beyond what they can get at a suburban country club or a gang or a dysfunctional family outside, because we've got them at the church, right? But if we can't offer them the hope of God, then we should shut it all down. All of it, every church and every seminary. To me, that is our call. That is our call.
And a hope that doesn't just boil down to optimism or confidence or having stuff or having resources or privilege, but a hope that's hard won. And I think this is where minoritized communities, I think, have a really important testimony to bear, because to think about the folks who have gone before us that could not have imagined the kind of spaces that sometimes we get to walk in, and to know that they lived in faithfulness, not naively, but in the determination that God's promises would come true for them and for the people who came after them.
And to recognize that for some of the folks who show up in our seminaries, for some of the folks who show up in our churches, I'll speak for myself as a Black woman, like, I look back at my history and I know that my grandparents and their parents and their parents, who could never have imagined me sitting on this stage in Richmond, Virginia, right? That, their hope is what brought me here. So we get to bear that forward, right? And to say, yeah.
I think on that note, I think maybe we'll move towards Q&A, because I think it's hard to follow that promise that you have lifted up for us about the hope and how, the connections between the past and the present and the future, and that we worship a God of hope. Lori Rabel, I'm going to call you out. In your emails, you always sign them off in the hope and promises. And like, I always, whenever I get an email from you and it says that, I'm like, that's it. It's the hope and the promises, right? It overcomes death and despair. Ken, do you want to collect cards? So if you have your question, he's coming around. If you're writing them down, go ahead and get that question onto a card, or send it over to Slido. And I believe Dr. Lockhart maybe has a question to offer us. Do you need a mic?
I think I can use mine.
No, you need a mic. You need a mic.
Online.
No. All right, can you hear me now? Yes. If you can hear me, snap.
Okay, there we go. All right, so there are lots of questions on Slido, so hopefully I'm sure there's just as many that Ken is grabbing. So the first one up is, the Association of Theological Schools says we will run out of students long before we run out of money. What should we do with the money?
So I think there's a difference between students and learners. And we may very well run out of students in a traditional sense. But I'm naive enough to think that we will never run out of learners, potential learners. And so I would invite the ATS to make that critical distinction.
We'll need to send a note to ATS.
I'll go back to, I mentioned earlier the Black Mountain School of Theology, which is a really amazing program located in Black Mountain, working with churches and cohorts to help them get organized and reach out into their communities. The ATS can support that kind of work that says pastors and lay people and communities can work together to become one community more and more. There's a whole lot of folk who need to be fed and housed, and listen, I don't know why churches are sitting on big endowments, because who are we saving it for when there are hungry people everywhere, including in the pews of those very wealthy churches?
Wonder too if engaging in the work of repair is an important part of this. So often in congregations, I'll talk about race and how we think about our differences, and they'll wonder, so what do we do with this? And I always say, I've just stepped foot into this congregation for the first time. I don't know your story, but there's probably a story in this congregation, and I know there are stories in all our seminaries about how we got to the place that we did, and on whose backs some of this success was built. So what might it look like to use some of those resources precisely for the work of local repair that reflects where our institutions have come from?
Thank you. Ken, do you have a question for us?
I do. One paradox and trap is trying to fix churches by fixing seminaries. How do seminaries deal with that? Ready for our next question?
This is a tough question. I'll just name a tension that's in my Intro to Preaching and Public Proclamation class. It's teaching students how to preach for the churches that are, and yet create a space in which students can unleash the imagination that they have for the church that might be. So it's a delicate tightrope walk in trying to be faithful to the congregations that keep us here doing the things that we're doing, and yet open up a pathway for students to dream and carry the church forward. So that's not a direct answer to the question, but that's the first thought that came to mind.
And also engage our imaginations in such a way that we think about the churches that are, and respectfully submit to them that they don't have to stay the way they are. That they too get to unleash their own imaginations, right? And say, just because this is the way we've always done worship, just because these are the songs the choir's always sung, just because this is the way we train elders, that doesn't mean that it has to stay that way. And so how are we going? You know, I think about, I was involved with First Pres Charlotte, and lots of other churches deal with this, right? People are joining our church just because they want to use the center aisle to get married. And so how do we screen people out so that it's not just that? Now, I'm not saying, right? But my question is, what are we doing as a church that people don't want to just be part of it? Yeah. That they only want to use the building? Right. Who are we that we're not drawing people in to want to be part of the community long after they get married, and perhaps if they have children, and then they can invite their neighbors? What is it, how are we unleashing our imagination such that the building, because Lord knows we can't sustain all these and maintain all these buildings, but to be the body of Christ in a way that other people want to join the body?
I'll just put a footnote on that before we go to the next question. I think sometimes we operate with a kind of corporate capitalist duality between like churches and the seminaries. Like the seminaries produce a product, which the church needs, and like, are we producing the product? And like that seems completely wrong-headed to me. We're in a deeply interdependent relationship with churches about who we are, what we're doing, and we're all actually doing it together. And so I think if we could change the way we think about the work that we do, that who we are together, that would help us get kind of past that sort of corporate way of thinking. Dr. Lockhart, you have another one?
Given that these seminaries reside in a very powerful nation, how should theologies that are taught be embodied in light of international conflicts our country is often involved in?
Okay. I'll start us off. That wins so far as most challenging question. I do think that, I'm just going to go back to what Rich and I think others were saying. We have to speak the truth as we know it out of the gospel, right? As we humbly, with humility, like you hold a bird in your hand. But we do have to speak the truth as we see it. But we have to do it in a way that has humility to it, that we don't always know all the answers. We just can't have that kind of arrogance. But we can speak truth where we see it insofar as we know it. And we're wrong if we don't do so. So it's otherwise, yeah, it's very challenging. If someone can figure out how to think about that better, I would love that.
I don't know how to think about it better, but I do know that this seems like a place for potential partnership for me in terms of, and this was, Rich, I think you were talking about, we got to stop thinking of ourselves as, silos unto ourselves, right? There are actually seminaries in other parts of the world, besides us, that have a lot to teach us. And we can't become experts on the ground in every place, right? But we can start by trying to open up some of the pathways between us and, other regions in which, we have people who we care about. And so, I think that there are places, and I know there are some seminaries that do this, where you create joint programs between two different countries, literally. And, now with technology, that's not something that's such a hurdle for everybody. But the fact that we tend not to think about our partners, our potential partners who don't share our soil, I think that makes us, inevitably, it shrinks, our footprint and our ability to speak with any kind of compassion outside of our own context.
And I think we can't forget that there are people from all over the world here, right?
That's
and
right,
so
yeah.
there are people in seminaries, there are people in our communities that we can be engaged in conversation with to say, help me understand, help me, but not teach me, not do the work for me, but let's engage in conversation right here. Yeah. And also, I would engage the premise of that question that the United States ought to be the standard by which we're measuring any of this, right? Like, yes, there's a lot of money here for some. There are a whole lot of weapons here. But what is our real power in the world? And again, as people of God, as followers of Jesus Christ, that's not my standard. That's not. How do we remind each other of what we are founded on and based on? And it's not who the United States is as a world power, but who we are and what God is up to in terms of, and let's remember what happens to empires.
Jessica, did you want to get in?
I think I was just going to add that I think opening those pathways allows us to then amplify the voices of the people who are on the ground and do know and usually do have some things that they'd like others to be knowing and doing. And so how can we use as another way of telling the truth? It doesn't have to be that we went and discovered it. It's already there, and we can use those partnerships to amplify the voices.
Ken, yeah, do you have another question for us?
How do people in ministry and in theological education how are they supposed to balance the challenges of needing a career, also known as a paycheck, and to do the work that may need to be done?
Great question.
I do think the question is putting, it's the finger on the pulse of what's happening in the church and in terms of leadership for the church around bivocational ministries. And I think going a little bit to Kenda's remark about credentialing, and we're not going to be out of the credentialing business. And I do think that the Presbyterian Church, I'll just say what I think about the PCUSA, does need to be doing some thinking about ministry and preparation for ministry and what it means for small churches in particular, so many of which are without an installed pastor, and how lay leaders are rising up out of the pews, but can't necessarily drop everything and go to seminary for 3 years. And here at Union, we have a Pathways program where folks can go through a series of very rigorous and serious courses of theological education taught by our faculty and become commissioned lay pastors. And a lot of people have done that. So that's not the only answer. That's not what I'm suggesting. But I do think that there's a lot of room there for us to be creative in our thinking about what leadership means in the church in our current context. I'm not on this panel, by the way. Sorry. But they gave me a mic, so.
Well, and maybe some of that goes back to the earlier question about what do we do with the money? That, are there ways to think more collectively about the money, and how do we fund some of the entrepreneurial, innovative things going on? Now we're meddling.
Yeah, I know. I think that a lot of this has to do with how what we are imagining, pastoral ministry or spiritual leadership looking like. And as long as it's a job, we in some ways are letting the economics drive the cart, right? And so I wonder, and this isn't really formed yet, but I had a conversation recently with, I'm United Methodist, and this was a district superintendent which means she's responsible for an area of churches in part of New Jersey. And she made the comment, she said, basically, I have a bunch of churches I can't send pastors to because they have an appointment process. The reason she can't send pastors to them is because they can afford a quarter-time pastor, but all she has are people who have pastoral jobs. She doesn't have anybody who's theologically trained, who wants to be that she knows of anyway, who is a quarter-time appointment. So what that has meant is she's got a bunch of churches now that have to close because they can't find anybody to lead these people, at the level of the economic reality they live in. Well, that says to me that the economics are driving the cart here, as opposed to the pastoral needs of these communities. And as we were talking, it occurred to me that we don't have a system. She's not far from Princeton Seminary. We ought to be the people who are helping prepare people for this. But we have only in the last minute created any kind of theological degree or offering for people who have jobs, right? We still assume people come to graduate school full-time to prepare for this thing. I know that we're way behind, but the fact is what we have fallen into the trap of is allowing the economic problems that face us to determine the shape of the leadership. And somehow we've got to flip that so that we can look at what are the needs of the leadership first. Now let's create a form of pastoral formation that can address the leadership, that can be supported, and because that's what they need, as opposed to this model that is left over from 19 whatever.
And can we be courageous enough to try things that might not work,
For
right?
sure.
So you've got
Absolutely.
students
Yeah.
in seminaries who live in New Jersey, right? And say, would you be willing to
Right.
try
Right.
to be a person who splits your time
Yep.
so that you can get to know other congregations and ATS can throw in some money and we can, so we can try these things. We can try these things
You're right.
and see what
You're
happens.
absolutely right. And it's like, that's what I'm saying about if we can't take risks to the point where we can die a little with that. It might bomb, but we don't know the next thing we have to do without trying plan A to get to plan B. You can't just start with plan B. You got to go through plan A to get there.
Dr. Lockhart.
All right, next question, and then after I'm going to give you this mic back because I have not heard your voice, and I apologize for taking it from you. If our work is to be in the world, to listen thoughtfully, and people have a 40-second attention span now, how much does preaching actually matter now? I didn't do that on purpose, Dr. Bowles.
Was that your question, Lakeisha?
It's in the Slido. It wasn't me.
Says Lakeisha Lockhart.
All right,
Saw
well,
you
they're
typing there,
laughing.
Lakeisha.
All of us are like, Rich?
So
I want to go in the corner and cry a little bit. Preaching may not matter ultimately. Proclamation matters.
Right.
Bearing witness matters. And so I'll stop there.
And I get so angry about these kinds of questions because those same people who complain about a 20-minute sermon get up from church and go watch 9 hours of football. So I don't buy it. But I would say that, in all seriousness, I would say that it says something about who we are as preachers. Because if we are standing in the pulpit and we are not proclaiming a compelling, God-honoring, soul-encouraging word, that's on me. I can't blame people for being bored if I haven't done my work. And so but don't tell me if you're about to go out and do what you do on a Sunday, I don't buy it. Because these same people will scroll on their phones for hours. So, yeah.
All right, that was a good one. Good work, Rich. I love the one-sentence answer that's just like the big slap-down, definitive answer. Wish I could do that. Ken?
Take your microphone since you're not on the panel. Today, President Lapsley is being inaugurated. Members of the panel, what is one thing you think President Lapsley ought to have her eye on?
Ken McFadden.
Nice one.
You know, I hope for yourself and for this community and for the rest of us too, that you help us keep our eyes on the horizon. That the future is uncertain and unclear, but that God's promises have been sure and certain for generations, and that the pressing crises of the moment are important, but sometimes there's a way in which our attention is being consumed with every crisis that comes along the way. And there's a certain form of politics that wants our attention constantly, because then we pay attention to certain figures or certain big national moments, so we don't see our neighbors. So to look to the horizon, not so that we neglect who's closest to us, but precisely for the hope of their future thriving. And they're thriving right now. So keep our eyes to the horizon.
I think mine's closely related to that, and I would hope you have your eye on practices of wisdom and discernment, especially as somebody who's going to be working with and under your leadership. is
You have a rather vested interest in
yeah.
this question.
Well, I mean, I'll say honestly that the work of being on the search committee that brought you here was hugely emotional work, right? Especially as somebody who's earlier in my career. And so I say with all honesty that I hope you keep your eyes on practices of wisdom and discernment that can lead all of us into a future that leads to flourishing for the life of the world.
Jesus.
Mic drop.
Yes.
Was that
Yes.
Jesus? No.
But I do think that, and I know, I didn't expect to cry when I said this. I know you're here because you love God. And you want to love God better. And that motivates everything that I've ever known you to do. And it would be so easy to get caught up in, all of this stuff. And at the end of the day, God doesn't care about this stuff. God cares about you. And that's what I want you to keep your eye on.
Oh, wait, no, someone else going to respond? I was just being.
I guess I would say that I hope you'll keep focused on what brings you delight and joy, because I think if you are leading out of your own sense of delight and joy, that will be infectious for every one of the rest of us, and will allow the space for this creativity and missteps and failures and learnings, but only if you've got that fuel. And some of that's Jesus, of course, but some of it's also those very tangible things that bring you joy.
I will say you sent us an article to read about that talked about blizzards and winter and the ice age and talked about COVID. Anyway, one of the things that came up in the article was the concern about 7 to 9-year-olds who got lost in the years of COVID and lost that window where children often learn to read fluently. And it made me think that COVID also had a similar effect on the church and on seminaries. And I hope that you will keep your eye on helping the seminary to catch up on its loss of fluency, right? To be able to read the community and read the world in a way that can then respond to the world's needs. And then I'll follow very selfishly by saying, I hope you'll keep an eye on the Charlotte campus. And I am really grateful that you have an office there. That says a lot to the student body. And I live in Charlotte and go to the seminary often for sermon research and prep. And so it's great to see you there and to see that you've laid down a stake and said, this is my home as well.
Thank you. Thank you to each of you for that wisdom, which I will treasure, literally treasure. And thank you to the person who posed the question so that I could have that wisdom.
All right, next question, and then I'll give you your mic back.
This might be the last one, too, just warning.
Oh, the pressure. Oh, there's so
I
many.
know,
Okay,
sorry.
pressure. Okay, better than last. All right, so what would the seminary look like as a dispersed body if that is going to be the reality of the church of the future, beyond just online education?
Can you say it again,
Yeah,
Keisha?
sure.
Sorry.
What would the seminary look like as a dispersed body if that is going to be the reality of the church of the future, beyond just online education?
I think one place to start is that that place will continue to matter, even if we're online, even if we're dispersed. That there are certain kinds of holy spaces, sacred spaces, historical spaces, soil and land that matters to us and to our people. And I think that even as we head toward online spaces, even as we're more dispersed, for us to reflect richly and well and theologically on land, on the stories that land holds, and the kind of storytelling that we can only do in certain kinds of spaces. So I think the particularity of space and place is one that we want to keep in front of us and think about really richly.
And I would say almost at the opposite end of the bell-shaped curve, before the Charlotte campus was that building was built on the campus of Sharon Presbyterian Church, the classes met at Queen's University. And I think that perhaps that sacred spaces where specific stories need to be told, but also all ground is holy ground. And if we take what we are trying to disperse and teach into a public library and say, hey, we're gonna have a class here every Thursday for the next 6 weeks. There will be people who are there every week, but if you wanna hear, come on and join us. I think that that becomes a way that we disperse. We take classes to the Y, we take classes to people's homes, and say, we're gonna do this in as many different ways as we can and see what sticks to the wall and what doesn't. But in the meantime, other people are being brought in and are learning and are seeing what seminaries are about.
I know there's been some conversation around forming partnerships with congregations to be hubs, right? Where seminary education is taking place with learners, right? And that's a hugely exciting possibility that we can flesh out more.
I think this might be true for, well, I hope it's true for more than just your seminary. But I'm imagining that we are moving into a period of, I'm going to call it focus and flare and focus and flare. It's like where I think the gathered community really matters. But we're not in a season where you come for 9 months and live there anymore. It's like, so what does it look like if we gather and disperse? It's kind of like Sunday and Monday, right? You gather and you disperse. That rhythm of church winds up being echoed in the rhythm of seminary too, right? We are formed as we come together, and then we're dispersed, and we learn what we can learn out there and come back and forth and back and forth. It means we use our spaces differently, but we still use our spaces. It means that we still have teachers and professors and so on, but they are not all necessarily in the same place at the same time. So anyway, that's where it looks like it's going to me.
I wonder too about, I remember learning a lot about exegeting my congregation in seminary, and I wonder more, like expanding that idea of about exegeting my neighborhood, exegeting my city, exegeting, so helping us learn more of the tools that help us know the place and the real people, not just who I assume are right there, but who are the actual real people. And I think that connects to a lot of what's been said. Also, what you're talking about makes me think of a colleague of mine who, before Theology on Tap was a cool thing, she used to just hold her weekly Bible study at McDonald's. Yeah. And she talked about how much that changed what they were doing, because it was such a different environment than anyone had done Bible study before, and real people were walking in with very real needs and very real human drama that was coming through the door. And so just I think about things like that just bring a different texture into the learning.
This is a really provocative question, and it raised in me a curiosity. First, a statement. I think that seminaries were formed and have predominantly been led by people who come from non-diasporic backgrounds. And so I'm wondering, in a way to get at the answer to this question, people like me need to learn and to attune myself to the wisdom of what has held diasporic communities together amidst dispersal and amidst potential disconnectivity. What are the power sources and the energy sources that keep these communities together and thriving amidst being dispersed and scattered? So for me, it opens up a curiosity.
I feel like it's appropriate that that we end on that question, that we end on a question that will keep us all continuing to think, since the panel was about a question. And so thank you so much, first of all, to our panelists. It's really helped me. I'm just so grateful to each of you for your wisdom, your willingness to be here, your good cheer. You're just fabulous humans. And to all of you, thank you so much for being here this afternoon. I understand at 4:30 there's something going on outside to which all of you are invited. So we look forward to seeing you then. Thank you.